Essay 24, Part 1 of the Last Essays of Elia by Charles Lamb. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A recording by Tony Addison. Popular Fallacies. 1. That a bully is always a coward. This axiom contains a principle of compensation which disposes us to admit the truth of it. But there is no safe trusting to dictionaries and definitions. We should more willingly fall in with this popular language if we did not find brutality sometimes awkwardly coupled with valour in the same vocabulary. The comic writers, with their poetical justice, have contributed not a little to mislead us upon this point. To see a hectoring fellow exposed and beaten upon the stage has something in it wonderfully diverting. Some people's share of animal spirits is notoriously low and defective. It has not strength to raise a vapour, or furnish out the wind of a tolerable bluster. These love to be told that huffing is no part of valour. The truest courage, with them, is that which is the least noisy and obtrusive. But confront one of these silent heroes with the swaggerer of real life, and his confidence in the theory quickly vanishes. Pretensions do not uniformly bespeak non-performance. A modest, inoffensive deportment does not necessarily imply valour. Neither does the absence of it justify us in denying that quality. Hickman wanted modesty. We do not mean him of Clarissa, but who ever doubted his courage? Even the poets, upon whom this equitable distribution of qualities should be most binding, have thought it agreeable to nature to depart from the rule upon occasion. Harafa in the Agonistes is indeed a bully upon the received notions. Milton has made him at once a blusterer, a giant, and a dastard. But Almanzor in Dryden talks of driving armies singly before him, and does it. Tom Brown had a shrewder insight into this kind of character than either of his predecessors. He divides the palm more equably, and allows his hero a sort of dimidiate pre-eminence. Bully Dawson kicked by half the town, and half the town kicked by Bully Dawson. This was true distributive justice. 2. That ill-gotten gain never prospers. The weakest part of mankind have this saying commonest in their mouth. It is the trite consolation administered to the easy dupe, when he has been tricked out of his money or estate, that the acquisition of it will do the owner no good. But the rogues of this world, the prudenter part of them at least, know better; and if the observation had been as true as it is old, would not have failed by this time to have discovered it. They have pretty sharp distinctions of the fluctuating and the permanent. Lightly come, lightly go, is a proverb which they can very well afford to leave, when they leave little else, to the losers. They do not always find manners, got by rapine or chicanery, insensibly to melt away, as the poets will have it, or that all gold glides, like thawing snow, from the thief's hand that grasps it. Church land, alienated to lay uses, was formerly denounced to have this slippery quality. But some portions of it somehow always stuck so fast, that the denunciators have been vain to postpone the prophecy of refundment to a late posterity. 3. That a man must not laugh at his own jest. The severest exaction surely ever invented upon the self‐denial of poor human nature. This is to expect a gentleman to give a treat without partaking of it, to sit esurient at his own table, and commend the flavour of his venison upon the absurd strength of his never touching it himself. On the contrary, we love to see a wag taste his own joke to his party, to watch a quirk or a merry conceit flickering upon the lips some seconds before the tongue is delivered of it. If it be good, fresh, and racy, begotten of the occasion, if he that utters it never thought it before, he is naturally the first to be tickled with it, and any suppression of such complaisance we hold to be churlish and insulting. What does it seem to imply but that your company is weak or foolish enough to be moved by an image or a fancy that shall stir you not at all, or but faintly? This is exactly the humour of the fine gentleman in Mandeville, who, while he dazzles his guests with the display of some costly toy, affects himself to see nothing considerable in it. 4. That such a one shows his breeding, that it is easy to perceive he is no gentleman. A speech from the poorer sort of people, which always indicates that the party vituperated is a gentleman. The very fact which they deny is that which galls and exasperates them to use this language. The forbearance with which it is usually received is a proof what interpretation the bystander sets upon it. Of a kin to this, and still less politic, are the phrases with which, in their street rhetoric, they ply one another more grossly. He is a poor creature, he has not a rag to cover, etc., though this last, we confess, is more frequently applied by females to females. They do not perceive that the satire glances upon themselves. A poor man, of all things in the world, should not upbraid an antagonist with poverty. Are there no other topics, as to tell him his father was hanged, his sister, etc., without exposing a secret which should be kept snug between them, and doing an affront to the order to which they have the honour equally to belong? All this while they do not see how the wealthier man stands by and laughs in his sleeve at both. 5. That the poor copy the vices of the rich. A smooth text to the latter, and preached from the pulpit, is sure of a docile audience from the pews lined with satin. It is twice sitting upon velvet to a foolish squire, to be told that he, and not perverse nature, as the homilies would make us imagine, is the true cause of all the irregularities in his parish. This is striking at the root of free will indeed, and denying the originality of sin in any sense. But men are not such implicit sheep as this comes to. If the abstinence from evil on the part of the upper classes is to derive itself from no higher principle than the apprehension of setting ill patterns to the lower, we beg leave to discharge them from all squeamishness on that score. They may even take their fill of pleasures where they can find them. The genius of poverty, hampered and straitened as it is not so barren of invention but it can trade upon the staple of its own vice, without drawing upon their capital. The poor are not quite such servile imitators as they take them for. Some of them are very clever artists in their way. Here and there we find an original. Who taught the poor to steal, to pilfer? They did not go to the great for schoolmasters in these faculties, surely. It is well if, in some vices, they allow us to be no copyists. In no other sense is it true that the poor copy them than as servants may be said to take after their masters and mistresses, when they succeed to their reversionary cold meats. If the master, from indisposition or some other cause, neglect his food, the servant dines notwithstanding. Oh, but some will say, the force of example is great. We knew a lady who was so scrupulous on this head that she would put up with the calls of the most impertinent visitor, rather than let her servants say she was not at home, for fear of teaching her maid to tell an untruth, and this in the very face of the fact, which she knew well enough, that the wench was one of the greatest liars upon the earth without teaching, so much so that her mistress possibly never heard 2 words of consecutive truth from her in her life. But nature must go for nothing. Example must be everything. This liar in grain, who never opened her mouth without a lie, must be guarded against a remote inference, which she, pretty casuist, might possibly draw from a form of words, literally false, but essentially deceiving no one, that under some circumstances a fib might not be so exceedingly sinful, a fiction, too, not at all in her own way, or one that she could be suspected of adopting, for few servant wenches care to be denied to visitors. This word example reminds us of another fine word which is in use upon these occasions, encouragement. People in our sphere must not be thought to give encouragement to such proceedings. To such a frantic height is this principle capable of being carried, that we have known individuals who have thought it within the scope of their influence to sanction despair and give éclat to suicide. A domestic in the family of a county member lately deceased, for love or some unknown cause, cut his throat, but not successfully. The poor fellow was otherwise much loved and respected, and great interest was used in his behalf upon his recovery, that he might be permitted to retain his place, his word being first pledged, not without some substantial sponsors to promise for him, that the like should never happen again. His master was inclinable to keep him, but his mistress thought otherwise, and John in the end was dismissed, her ladyship declaring that she could not think of encouraging any such doings in the county. 6. That enough is as good as a feast. Not a man, woman, or child in 10 miles round Guildhall who really believes this saying. The inventor of it did not believe it himself. It was made in revenge by somebody who was disappointed of a regale. It is a vile, cold scrag of mutton sophism, a lie palmed upon the palate which knows better things. If nothing else could be said for a feast, this is sufficient, that from the superflux there is usually something left for the next day. Morally interpreted, it belongs to a class of proverbs which have a tendency to make us undervalue money. Of this cast are those notable observations that money is not health, riches cannot purchase everything, the metaphor which makes gold to be mere muck, with the morality which traces fine clothing to the sheep's back, and denounces pearl as the unhandsome excretion of an oyster. Hence, too, the phrase which imputes dirt to acres, a sophistry so barefaced that even the literal sense of it is true only in a wet season. This, and abundance of similar sage saws, assuming to inculcate content, we verily believe to have been the invention of some cunning borrower, who had designs upon the purse of his wealthier neighbour, which he could only hope to carry by force of these verbal jugglings. Translate any one of these sayings out of the artful metonyme which envelops it, and the trick is apparent. Goodly legs and shoulders of mutton, exhilarating cordials, books, pictures, the opportunities of seeing foreign countries, independence, heart's ease, a man's own time to himself, are not muck. However, we may be pleased to scandalize with that appellation the faithful metal that provides them for us. 7. Of two disputants, the warmest is generally in the wrong. Our experience would lead us to quite an opposite conclusion. Temper, indeed, is no test of truth, but warmth and earnestness are a proof at least of a man's own conviction of the rectitude of that which he maintains. Coolness is as often the result of an unprincipled indifference to truth or falsehood, as of a sober confidence in a man's own side in a dispute. Nothing is more insulting sometimes than the appearance of this philosophic temper. There is little Titubus, the stammering law-stationer in Lincoln's Inn. We have seldom known this shrewd little fellow engaged in an argument where we were not convinced he had the best of it, if his tongue would but fairly have seconded him. When he has been spluttering excellent broken sense for an hour together, writhing and labouring to be delivered at the point of dispute, the very gist of the controversy knocking at his teeth, which, like some obstinate iron grating, still obstructed its deliverance, his puny frame convulsed, and face reddening all over at an unfairness in the logic which he wanted articulation to expose, it has moved our gall to see a smooth portly fellow of an adversary, that cared not a button for the merits of the question, by merely laying his hand upon the head of the stationer, and desiring him to be calm. Your tall disputants have always the advantage. With a provoking sneer, carry the argument clean from him in the opinion of all the bystanders, who have gone away clearly convinced that Titubus must have been in the wrong, because he was in a passion, and that Mr. Blank, meaning his opponent, is one of the fairest, and at the same time one of the most dispassionate arguers breathing. 8. That verbal allusions are not wit, because they will not bear a translation. The same might be said of the wittiest local allusions. A custom is sometimes as difficult to explain to a foreigner as a pun. What would become of a great part of the wit of the last age if it were tried by this test? How would certain topics, as aldermanity, cuckoldry, have sounded to a Terentian auditory, though Terence himself had been alive to translate them? Senator Urbanus, with coruca to boot for a synonym, would but faintly have done the business. Words involving notions are hard enough to render. It is too much to expect us to translate a sound, and give an elegant version to a jingle. The Virgilian harmony is not translatable but by substituting harmonious sounds in another language for it. To Latinize a pun, we must seek a pun in Latin that will answer to it, as to give an idea of the double endings in Hudibras, we must have recourse to a similar practice in the old monkish doggerel. Dennis, the fiercest oppugner of puns in ancient or modern times, professes himself highly tickled with the astic, chiming to ecclesiastic. Yet what is this but a species of pun, a verbal consonance? End of Essay 24, Part 1. Essay 24, Part 2 of The Last Essays of Elia by Charles Lamb. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Addison. Popular fallacies. 9. That the worst puns are the best. If by worst be only meant the most far-fetched and startling, we agree to it. A pun is not bound by the laws which limit nicer wit. It is a pistol let off at the ear, not a feather to tickle the intellect. It is an antic which does not stand upon manners, but comes bounding into the presence, and does not show the less comic for being dragged in sometimes by the head and shoulders. What though it limp a little, or prove defective in one leg? All the better. A pun may easily be too curious and artificial. Who has not at one time or other been at a party of professors, himself perhaps an old offender in that line, where, after ringing a round of the most ingenious conceits, every man contributing his shot, and some there the most expert shooters of the day, after making a poor word run the gauntlet till it is ready to drop, after hunting and winding it through all the possible ambages of similar sounds, after squeezing and hauling and tugging at it, till the very milk of it will not yield a drop further, suddenly some obscure, unthought-of fellow in a corner, who was never prenticed to the trade, whom the company for very pity passed over, as we do by a known poor man when a money subscription is going round, no one calling upon him for his quota, has all at once come out with something so whimsical, yet so pertinent, so brazen in its pretensions, yet so impossible to be denied, so exquisitely good, and so deplorably bad at the same time, that it has proved a Robin Hood shot. Anything ulterior to that is despaired of, and the party breaks up, unanimously voting it to be the very worst, that is, best, pun of the evening. This species of wit is the better for not being perfect in all its parts. What it gains in completeness it loses in naturalness. The more exactly it satisfies the critical, the less hold it has upon some other faculties. The puns which are most entertaining are those which will least bear an analysis. Of this kind is the following, recorded with a sort of stigma in one of Swift's Miscellanies. An Oxford scholar, meeting a porter who was carrying a hare through the streets, accosts him with this extraordinary question: "Prithee, friend, is that thy own hare, or a wig?" There is no excusing this, and no resisting it. A man might blur 10 sides of paper in attempting a defence of it against a critic who should be laughter-proof. The quibble in itself is not considerable. It is only a new turn given by a little false pronunciation to a very common, though not very courteous, enquiry. Put by one gentleman to another at a dinner-party, it would have been vapid. To the mistress of the house it would have shown much less wit than rudeness. We must take in the totality of time, place, and person, the pert look of the inquiring scholar, the desponding look of the puzzled porter, the one stopping at leisure, the other hurrying on with his burthen, the innocent, though rather abrupt, tendency of the first member of the question, with the utter and inextricable irrelevancy of the second, the place a public street, not favourable to frivolous investigations, the affrontive quality of the primitive inquiry, the common question, invidiously transferred to the derivative, the new turn given to it in the implied satire, namely, that few of that tribe are expected to eat of the good things which they carry, they being in most countries considered rather as the temporary trustees than owners of such dainties, which the fellow was beginning to understand, but then the wig again comes in, and he can make nothing of it. All put together constitute a picture. Hogarth could have made it intelligible on canvas. Yet 9 out of 10 critics will pronounce this a very bad pun, because of the defectiveness in the concluding member, which is its very beauty, and constitutes the surprise. The same persons shall cry up for admirable the cold quibble from Virgil about the broken Cremona, Swift, because it is made out in all its parts, and leaves nothing to the imagination. We venture to call it cold, because of thousands who have admired it, it would be difficult to find one who has heartily chuckled at it. As appealing to the judgment merely, setting the risible faculty aside, we must pronounce it a monument of curious felicity. But as some stories are said to be too good to be true, it may with equal truth be asserted of this bi-verbal allusion that it is too good to be natural. One cannot help suspecting that the incident was invented to fit the line. It would have been better had it been less perfect. Like some Virgilian hemistiches, it has suffered by filling up. The nimium vicina was enough in conscience. The cremona afterwards loads it. It is, in fact, a double pun, and we have always observed that a superfetation in this sort of wit is dangerous. When a man has said a good thing, it is seldom politic to follow it up. We do not care to be cheated a second time, or perhaps the mind of man, with reverence be it spoken, is not capacious enough to lodge two puns at a time. The impression, to be forcible, must be simultaneous and undivided. 10. That handsome is that handsome does. Those who use this proverb can never have seen Mrs. Conrady. The soul, if we may believe Plotinus, is a ray from the celestial beauty. As she partakes more or less of this heavenly light, she informs with corresponding characters the fleshly tenement which she chooses, and frames to herself a suitable mansion. All which only proves that the soul of Mrs. Conrady, in her pre‐existent state, was no great judge of architecture. To the same effect, in a hymn in honour of beauty, divine Spenser, Platonizing, sings: "Every spirit, as it is more pure, and hath in it the more of heavenly light, so it the fairer body doth procure to habit in, and it more fairly dight with cheerful grace and amiable sight. For of the soul the body form doth take, for soul is form, and doth the body make." But Spenser, it is clear, never saw Mrs. Conrady. These poets, we find, are no safe guides in philosophy. For here, in his very next stanza but one, is a saving clause, which throws us all out again, and leaves us as much to seek as ever. "Yet oft it falls that many a gentle mind dwells in deformed tabernacle drowned, either by chance against the course of kind, or through unaptness in the substance found, which it assumed of some stubborn ground, that will not yield unto her form's direction, but is performed with some foul imperfection." From which it would follow that Spenser had seen somebody like Mrs. Conrady. The spirit of this good lady, her previous anima, must have stumbled upon one of these untoward tabernacles which he speaks of. A more rebellious commodity of clay for a ground, as the poet calls it, no gentle mind, and sure hers is one of the gentlest, ever had to deal with. Pondering upon her inexplicable visage, inexplicable we mean but by this modification of the theory, we have come to a conclusion that, if one must be plain, it is better to be plain all over than, amidst a tolerable residue of features, to hang out one that shall be exceptionable. No one can say of Mrs. Conrady's countenance that it would be better if she had but a nose. It is impossible to pull her to pieces in this manner. We have seen the most malicious beauties of her own sex baffled in the attempt at a selection. The tout ensemble defies particularizing. It is too complete, too consistent, as we may say, to admit of these invidious reservations. It is not as if some Apelles had picked out here a lip and there a chin, out of the collected ugliness of Greece, to frame a model by. It is a symmetrical whole. We challenge the minutest connoisseur to cavil at any part or parcel of the countenance in question, to say that this or that is improperly placed. We are convinced that true ugliness, no less than is affirmed of true beauty, is the result of harmony. Like that too, it reigns without a competitor. No one ever saw Mrs. Conrady without pronouncing her to be the plainest woman that he ever met with in the course of his life. The first time that you are indulged with a sight of her face is an era in your existence ever after. You are glad to have seen it, like Stonehenge. No one can pretend to forget it. No one ever apologized to her for meeting her in the street on such a day and not knowing her. The pretext would be too bare. Nobody can mistake her for another. Nobody can say of her, "I think I have seen that face somewhere, but I cannot call to mind where." You must remember that in such a parlour it first struck you, like a bust. You wondered where the owner of the house had picked it up. You wondered more when it began to move its lips, so mildly too. No one ever thought of asking her to sit for her picture. Lockets are for remembrance, and it would be clearly superfluous to hang an image at your heart, which, once seen, can never be out of it. It is not a mean face either. Its entire originality precludes that. Neither is it of that order of plain faces which improve upon acquaintance. Some very good but ordinary people, by an unwearied perseverance in good offices, put a cheat upon our eyes, juggle our senses out of their natural impressions, and set us upon discovering good indications in a countenance which at first sight promised nothing less. We detect gentleness which had escaped us, lurking about an under lip. But when Mrs. Conrady has done you a service, her face remains the same. When she has done you 1,000, and you know that she is ready to double the number, still it is that individual face. Neither can you say of it that it would be a good face if it was not marked by the small-pox, a compliment which is always more admissive than excusatory. For either Mrs. Conrady never had the small-pox, or, as we say, took it kindly. No, it stands upon its own merits fairly. There it is. It is her mark, her token. That which she is known by. 11. That we must not look a gift‐horse in the mouth, nor a lady's age in the parish register. We hope we have more delicacy than to do either, but some faces spare us the trouble of these dental inquiries. And what if the beast, which my friend would force upon my acceptance, prove, upon the face of it, a sorry Rosinante, a lean ill‐favoured jade, whom no gentleman could think of setting up in his stables? Must I, rather than not be obliged to my friend, make her a companion to Eclipse or Lightfoot? A horse‐giver, no more than a horse‐seller, has a right to palm his spavined article upon us for good wear. An equivalent is expected in either case, and with my own good will I would no more be cheated out of my thanks than out of my money. Some people have a knack of putting upon you gifts of no real value, to engage you to substantial gratitude. We thank them for nothing. Our friend Metus carries this humour of never refusing a present to the very point of absurdity, if it were possible to couple the ridiculous with so much mistaken delicacy and real good nature. Not an apartment in his fine house, and he has a true taste in household decorations, but is stuffed up with some preposterous print or mirror, the worst adapted to his panels that may be, the presence of his friends that know his weakness, while his noble Vandykes are displaced, to make room for a set of daubs, the work of some wretched artist of his acquaintance, who, having had them returned upon his hands for bad likenesses, finds his account in bestowing them here gratis. The good creature has not the heart to mortify the painter at the expense of an honest refusal. It is pleasant, if it did not vex one at the same time, to see him sitting in his dining‐parlour, surrounded with obscure aunts and cousins to God knows whom, while the true Lady Marys and Lady Bettys of his own honourable family, in favour to these adopted frights, are consigned to the staircase and the lumber‐room. In like manner his goodly shelves are one by one stripped of his favourite old authors, to give place to a collection of presentation copies, the flower and bran of modern poetry. A presentation copy, reader, if haply you are yet innocent of such favours, is a copy of a book which does not sell, sent you by the author, with his foolish autograph at the beginning of it, for which, if a stranger, he only demands your friendship. If a brother author, he expects from you a book of yours, which does sell, in return. We can speak to experience, having by us a tolerable assortment of these gift‐horses. Not to ride a metaphor to death, we are willing to acknowledge that in some gifts there is sense. A duplicate out of a friend's library, where he has more than one copy of a rare author, is intelligible. There are favours, short of the pecuniary, a thing not fit to be hinted at among gentlemen, which confer as much grace upon the acceptor as the offerer. The kind, we confess, which is most to our palate, is of those little conciliatory missives, which for their vehicle generally choose a hamper, little odd presents of game, fruit, perhaps wine, though it is essential to the delicacy of the latter that it be home‐made. We love to have our friend in the country sitting thus at our table by proxy, to apprehend his presence, though 100 miles may be between us, by a turkey, whose goodly aspect reflects to us his plump corpusculum, to taste him in grouse or woodcock, to feel him gliding down in the toast peculiar to the latter, to concorporate him in a slice of Canterbury brawn. This is indeed to have him with ourselves, to know him intimately. Such participation is, methinks, unitive, as the old theologians phrase it. For these considerations we should be sorry if certain restrictive regulations, which are thought to bear hard upon the peasantry of this country, were entirely done away with. A hare, as the law now stands, makes many friends. Caius conciliates Titius, knowing his gout, with a leash of partridges. Titius, suspecting his partiality for them, passes them to Lucius, who, in his turn, preferring his friend's relish to his own, makes them over to Marcius, till in their ever‐widening progress and round of unconscious circummigration, they distribute the seeds of harmony over half a parish. we are well disposed to this kind of sensible remembrances, and are the less apt to be taken by those little airy tokens, impalpable to the palate, which under the names of rings, lockets, keepsakes, amuse some people's fancy mightily. We could never away with these indigestible trifles. They are the very kickshaws and foppery of friendship. 12. That home is home, though it is never so homely. Homes there are, we are sure, that are no homes. The home of the very poor man, and another which we shall speak to presently. Crowded places of cheap entertainment, and the benches of alehouses, if they could speak, might bear mournful testimony to the first. To them the very poor man resorts for an image of the home which he cannot find at home, for a starved grate and a scanty firing that is not enough to keep alive the natural heat in the fingers of so many shivering children with their mother. He finds in the depth of winter always a blazing hearth and a hob to warm his pittance of beer by. Instead of the clamours of a wife made gaunt by famishing, he meets with a cheerful attendance beyond the merits of the trifle which he can afford to spend. He has companions which his home denies him, for the very poor man has no visitors. He can look into the goings-on of the world, and speak a little to politics. At home there are no politics stirring but the domestic. All interests, real or imaginary, all topics that should expand the mind of man and connect him to a sympathy with general existence, are crushed in the absorbing consideration of food to be obtained for the family. Beyond the price of bread, news is senseless and impertinent. At home there is no larder. Here there is at least a show of plenty, and while he cooks his lean scrap of butcher's meat before the common bars, or munches his humbler cold viands, his relishing bread and cheese with an onion in a corner, when no one reflects upon his poverty, he has sight of the substantial joint providing for the landlord and his family. He takes an interest in the dressing of it, and while he assists in removing the trivet from the fire, he feels that there is such a thing as beef and cabbage, which he was beginning to forget at home. All this while he deserts his wife and children. But what wife and what children? Prosperous men, who object to this desertion, image to themselves some clean contented family like that which they go home to. But look at the countenance of the poor wives who follow and persecute their good man to the door of the public house which he is about to enter, when something like shame would restrain him, if stronger misery did not induce him to pass the threshold. That face, ground by want, in which every cheerful, every conversable lineament has been long effaced by misery, is that a face to stay at home with? Is it more a woman or a wild cat? Alas! it is the face of the wife of his youth that once smiled upon him. It can smile no longer. What comforts can it share? What burthens can it lighten? Oh, 'tis a fine thing to talk of the humble meal shared together. But what if there be no bread in the cupboard? The innocent prattle of his children takes out the sting of a man's poverty. But the children of the very poor do not prattle. It is none of the least frightful features in that condition, that there is no childishness in its dwellings. "Poor people," said a sensible old nurse to us once, "do not bring up their children, they drag them up." The little careless darling of the wealthier nursery, in their hovel, is transformed betimes into a premature, reflecting person. No one has time to dandle it, no one thinks it worth while to coax it, to soothe it, to toss it up and down, to humour it. There is none to kiss away its tears. If it cries it can only be beaten. It has been prettily said that a babe is fed with milk and praise. But the aliment of this poor babe was thin, unnourishing, the return to its little baby tricks and efforts to engage attention, bitter, ceaseless objurgation. It never had a toy, or knew what a coral meant. It grew up without the lullaby of nurses. It was a stranger to the patient fondle, the hushing caress, the attracting novelty, the costlier plaything, or the cheaper off-hand contrivance to divert the child, the prattled nonsense best sense to it, the wise impertinences, the wholesome lies, the apt story interposed, that puts a stop to present sufferings, and awakens the passion of young wonder. It was never sung to. No one ever told to it a tale of the nursery. It was dragged up to live or to die as it happened. It had no young dreams. It broke at once into the iron realities of life. A child exists not for the very poor as any object of dalliance. It is only another mouth to be fed, a pair of little hands to be betimes inured to labour. It is the rival, till it can be the co-operator for food with the parent. It is never his mirth, his diversion, his solace. It never makes him young again with recalling his young times. The children of the very poor have no young times. It makes the very heart to bleed to overhear the casual street talk between a poor woman and her little girl, a woman of the better sort of poor, in a condition rather above the squalid beings which we have been contemplating. It is not of toys, of nursery books, of summer holidays fitting that age, of the promised sight or play, of praised sufficiency at school. It is of mangling and clear-starching, of the price of coals or of potatoes. The questions of the child, that should be the very outpourings of curiosity and idleness, are marked with forecast and melancholy providence. It has come to be a woman before it was a child. It has learned to go to market. It chaffers, it haggles, it envies, it murmurs. It is knowing, acute, sharpened. It never prattles. Had we not reason to say that the home of the very poor is no home? There is yet another home which we are constrained to deny to be one. It has a larder, which the home of the poor man wants, its fireside conveniences, of which the poor dream not. But with all this it is no home. It is the house of the man that is infested with many visitors. May we be branded for the veriest churl if we deny our heart to the many noble‐hearted friends that at times exchange their dwelling for our poor roof. It is not of guests that we complain, but of endless, purposeless visitants, droppers in, as they are called. We sometimes wonder from what sky they fall. It is the very error of the position of our lodging. Its horoscopy was ill calculated, being just situate in a medium, a plaguy suburban mid-space, fitted to catch idlers from town or country. We are older than we were, and age is easily put out of its way. we have fewer sands in our glass to reckon upon, and we cannot brook to see them drop in endlessly succeeding impertinences. At our time of life, to be alone sometimes is as needful as sleep. It is the refreshing sleep of the day. The growing infirmities of age manifest themselves in nothing more strongly than in an inveterate dislike of interruption. The thing which we are doing, we wish to be permitted to do. We have neither much knowledge nor devices, but there are fewer in the place to which we hasten. We are not willingly put out of our way, even at a game of ninepins. While youth was, we had vast reversions in time future. We are reduced to a present pittance, and obliged to economize in that article. We bleed away our moments now as hardly as our ducats. We cannot bear to have our thin wardrobe eaten and fretted into by moths. We are willing to barter our good time with a friend who gives us in exchange his own. Herein is the distinction between the genuine guest and the visitant. This latter takes your good time and gives you his bad in exchange. The guest is domestic to you as your good cat or household bird. The visitant is your fly, that flaps in at your window and out again, leaving nothing but a sense of disturbance and victuals spoiled. The inferior functions of life begin to move heavily. We cannot concoct our food with interruptions. Our chief meal, to be nutritive, must be solitary. With difficulty we can eat before a guest, and never understood what the relish of public feasting meant. Meats have no sapor, nor digestion fair play in a crowd. The unexpected coming in of a visitant stops the machine. There is a punctual generation who time their calls to the precise commencement of your dining hour, not to eat, but to see you eat. Our knife and fork drop instinctively, and we feel that we have swallowed our latest morsel. Others again show their genius, as we have said, in knocking the moment you have just sat down to a book. They have a peculiar compassionating sneer with which they hope that they do not interrupt your studies, though they flutter off the next moment to carry their impertinences to the nearest student that they can call their friend. The tone of the book is spoiled. We shut the leaves, and, with Dante's lovers, read no more that day. It were well if the effect of intrusion were simply coextensive with its presence, but it mars all the good hours afterwards. These scratches in appearance leave an orifice that closes not hastily. It is a prostitution of the bravery of friendship, says worthy Bishop Taylor, to spend it upon impertinent people who are, it may be, loads to their families, but can never ease my loads. This is the secret of their gaddings, their visits, and morning calls. They too have homes, which are no homes. 13. That you must love me, and love my dog. Good sir, or madam, as it may be, we most willingly embrace the offer of your friendship. We long have known your excellent qualities. We have wished to have you nearer to us, to hold you within the very innermost fold of our heart. We can have no reserve towards a person of your open and noble nature. The frankness of your humour suits us exactly. We have been long looking for such a friend. Quick, let us disburthen our troubles into each other's bosom. Let us make our single joys shine by reduplication. But, yap, 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 what is this confounded cur? He has fastened his tooth, which is none of the bluntest, just in the fleshy part of my leg. It is my dog, sir. You must love him for my sake. Here, test, test, test. But he has bitten me. Ay, that he is apt to do, till you are better acquainted with him. I have had him 3 years. He never bites me. Yap, yap, yap. He is at it again. Oh, sir, you must not kick him. He does not like to be kicked. I expect my dog to be treated with all the respect due to myself. But do you always take him out with you when you go a friendship hunting? Invariably. 'Tis the sweetest, prettiest, best conditioned animal. I call him my test, the touchstone by which I try a friend. No one can properly be said to love me who does not love him. Excuse us, dear sir or madam aforesaid, if, upon further consideration, we are obliged to decline the otherwise invaluable offer of your friendship. We do not like dogs. Mighty well, sir. You know the conditions. You may have worse offers. Come along, Test. The above dialogue is not so imaginary, but that in the intercourse of life we have had frequent occasions of breaking off an agreeable intimacy by reason of these canine appendages. They do not always come in the shape of dogs. They sometimes wear the more plausible and human character of kinsfolk, near acquaintances, my friend's friend, his partner, his wife, or his children. We could never yet form a friendship, not to speak of more delicate correspondences, however much to our taste, without the intervention of some third anomaly, some impertinent clog affixed to the relation, the understood dog in the proverb. The good things of life are not to be had singly, but come to us with a mixture, like a schoolboy's holiday, with a task affixed to the tail of it. What a delightful companion is X, if he did not always bring his tall cousin with him! He seems to grow with him, like some of those double births which we remember to have read of with such wonder and delight in the old Athenian oracle, where Swift commenced author by writing Pindaric odes (what a beginning for him!) upon Sir William Temple. There is the picture of the brother, with the little brother peeping out at his shoulder, a species of fraternity which we have no name of kin close enough to comprehend. When X comes poking in his head and shoulders into your room, as if to feel his entry, you think, surely you have now got him to yourself. What a 3 hours' chat we shall have! But ever in the haunch of him, and before his diffident body is well disclosed in your apartment, appears the haunting shadow of the cousin, overpeering his modest kinsman, and sure to overlay the expected good talk with his insufferable procerity of stature and uncorresponding dwarfishness of observation. Misfortunes seldom come alone. 'Tis hard when a blessing comes accompanied. Cannot we, like Sempronia, without sitting down to chess with her eternal brother? Or know Sulpicia, without knowing all the round of her card‐playing relations? Must my friend's brethren of necessity be mine also? Must we be hand and glove with Dick Selby the parson, or Jack Selby the calico printer, because W.S., who is neither, but a ripe wit and a critic, has the misfortune to claim a common parentage with them? Let him lay down his brothers, and 'tis odds but we will cast him in a pair of ours (we have a superflux) to balance the concession. Let F.H. lay down his garrulous uncle, and Honorius dismiss his vapid wife, and superfluous establishment of 6 boys, things between boy and manhood, too ripe for play, too raw for conversation, that come in impudently staring their father's old friend out of countenance, and will neither aid nor let alone the conference, that we may once more meet upon equal terms, as we were wont to do in the disengaged state of bachelorhood. It is well if your friend or mistress be content with these canicular probations. Few young ladies but in this sense keep a dog. But when Rutilia hounds at you her tiger aunt, or Ruspina expects you to cherish and fondle her viper sister, whom she has preposterously taken into her bosom to try stinging conclusions upon your constancy, they must not complain if the house be rather thin of suitors. Scylla must have broken off many excellent matches in her time, if she insisted upon all that loved her, loving her dogs also. An excellent story to this moral is told of Merry of Delacruscan memory. In tender youth he loved and courted a modest appanage to the opera, in truth a dancer, who had won him by the artless contrast between her manners and situation. She seemed to him a native violet that had been transplanted by some rude accident into that exotic and artificial hotbed. Nor, in truth, was she less genuine and sincere than she appeared to him. He wooed and won this flower only for appearance sake, and for due honour to the bride's relations. She craved that she might have the attendance of her friends and kindred at the approaching solemnity. The request was too amiable not to be conceded, and in this solicitude for conciliating the good will of more relations, he found a presage of her superior attentions to himself, when the golden shaft should have killed the flock of all affections else. The morning came, and at the Star and Garter, Richmond, the place appointed for the breakfasting, accompanied with one English friend, he impatiently awaited what reinforcements the bride should bring to grace the ceremony. A rich muster she had made. They came in 6 coaches, the whole corps du ballet, French, Italian, men and women. Monsieur de Beau, the famous pirouetter of the day, led his fair spouse, but craggy from the banks of the Seine. The prima donna had sent her excuse, but the first and second buffa were there, and Signor Scaparelli, and Signora Charmian, and Madame Violetta, with a countless cavalcade besides of choruses, figurantes, at the sight of whom Mary afterwards declared that then for the first time it struck him seriously that he was about to marry a dancer. But there was no help for it. Besides, it was her day. These were, in fact, her friends and kinsfolk. The assemblage, though whimsical, was all very natural. But when the bride, handing out of the last coach a still more extraordinary figure than the rest, presented to him as her father, the gentleman that was to give her away, no less a person than Signor Delpini himself, with a sort of pride, as much as to say, "See what I have brought to do us honour." The thought of so extraordinary a paternity quite overcame him, and slipping away under some pretence from the bride and her motley adherents, poor Mary took horse from the back yard to the nearest sea coast, from which, shipping himself to America, he shortly after consoled himself with a more congenial match in the person of Miss Brunton, relieved from his intended clown father, and a bevy of painted buffars for bridesmaids. 14. That we should rise with the lark. At what precise minute that little airy musician doffs his night gear, and prepares to tune up his unseasonable matins, we are not naturalists enough to determine. But for a mere human gentleman, that has no orchestra business to call him from his warm bed to such preposterous exercises, we take 10 or half after 10, 11 of course, during this Christmas solstice, to be the very earliest hour at which he can begin to think of abandoning his pillow. To think of it, we say, for to do it in earnest requires another half hour's good consideration. Not but there are pretty sun-risings, as we are told, and such like gauds abroad in the world, in summer time especially, some hours before what we have assigned, which a gentleman may see, as they say, only for getting up. But having been tempted once or twice in earlier life to assist at those ceremonies, we confess our curiosity abated. We are no longer ambitious of being the sun's courtiers, to attend at his morning levees. We hold the good hours of the dawn too sacred to waste them upon such observances, which have in them besides something pagan and Persic. To say truth, we never anticipated our usual hour, or got up with the sun, as 'tis called, to go a journey, or upon a foolish whole day's pleasuring, but we suffered for it all the long hours after in listlessness and headaches, Nature herself sufficiently declaring her sense of our presumption in aspiring to regulate our frail waking courses by the measures of that celestial and sleepless traveller. We deny not that there is something sprightly and vigorous, at the outset especially, in these break-of-day excursions. It is flattering to get the start of a lazy world, to conquer death by proxy in his image. But the seeds of sleep and mortality are in us, and we pay usually in strange qualms before night falls the penalty of the unnatural inversion. Therefore, while the busy part of mankind are fast huddling on their clothes are already up and about their occupations, content to have swallowed their sleep by wholesale, we chose to linger abed and digest our dreams. It is the very time to recombine the wandering images which night in a confused mass presented, to snatch them from forgetfulness, to shape and mould them. Some people have no good of their dreams. Like fast feeders, they gulp them too grossly to taste them curiously. We love to chew the cud of a foregone vision, to collect the scattered rays of a brighter phantasm, or act over again with firmer nerves the sadder nocturnal tragedies, to drag into daylight a struggling and half-vanishing nightmare, to handle and examine the terrors or the airy solaces. We have too much respect for these spiritual communications to let them go so lightly. We are not so stupid or so careless as that imperial forgetter of his dreams, that we should need a seer to remind us of the form of them. They seem to us to have as much significance as our waking concerns, or rather to import us more nearly, as more nearly we approach by years to the shadowy world whither we are hastening. We have shaken hands with the world's business, we have done with it, we have discharged ourselves of it. Why should we get up? We have neither suit to solicit nor affairs to manage. The drama has shut in upon us at the fourth act. We have nothing here to expect but in a short time a sick bed and a dismissal. We delight to anticipate death by such shadows as night affords. We are already half acquainted with ghosts. We were never much in the world. Disappointment early struck a dark veil between us and its dazzling illusions. Our spirits showed grey before our hairs. The mighty changes of the world already appear as but the vain stuff out of which dramas are composed. We have asked no more of life than what the mimic images in playhouses present us with. Even those types have waxed fainter. Our clock appears to have struck. We are superannuated. In this dearth of mundane satisfaction, we contract politic alliances with shadows. It is good to have friends at court. The abstracted media of dreams seems no ill introduction to that spiritual presence upon which in no long time we expect to be thrown. We are trying to know a little of the usages of that colony, to learn the language and the faces we shall meet with there, that we may be the less awkward at our first coming among them. We willingly call a phantom our fellow, as knowing we shall soon be of their dark companionship. Therefore we cherish dreams. We try to spell in them the alphabet of the invisible world, and think we know already how it shall be with us. Those uncouth shapes, which, while we clung to flesh and blood, affrighted us, have become familiar. We feel attenuated into their meagre essences, and have given the hand of half-way approach to incorporeal being. We once thought life to be something, but it has unaccountably fallen from us before its time. Therefore we choose to dally with visions. The sun has no purposes of ours to light us to. Why should we get up? 15. that we should lie down with the Lamb. We could never quite understand the philosophy of this arrangement, or the wisdom of our ancestors in sending us for instruction to these woolly bedfellows. A sheep, when it is dark, has nothing to do but to shut his silly eyes and sleep if he can. Man found out long sixes. Hail, candle light! Without disparagement to sun or moon, the kindliest luminary of the three, if we may not rather style thee their radiant deputy, mild viceroy of the moon. We love to read, talk, sit silent, eat, drink, sleep by candle light. They are everybody's sun and moon. This is our peculiar and household planet. Wanting it, what savage, unsocial nights must our ancestors have spent, wintering in caves and unillumined fastnesses! They must have lain about and grumbled at one another in the dark. What repartees could have passed, when you must have felt about for a smile, and handled a neighbour's cheek to be sure that he understood it? This accounts for the seriousness of the elder poetry. It has a sombre cast, try Hesiod or Ossian, derived from the tradition of those unlanterned nights. Jokes came in with candles. We wonder how they saw to pick up a pin, if they had any. How did they sup? What a mélange of chance carving they must have made of it! Here one had got a leg of a goat when he wanted a horse's shoulder. There another had dipped his scooped palm in a kidskin of wild honey when he meditated right mare's milk. There is neither good eating nor drinking in fresco. Who even in these civilized times has never experienced this, when at some economic table he has commenced dining after dusk, and waited for the flavour till the lights came? The senses absolutely give and take reciprocally. Can you tell pork from veal in the dark? Or distinguish Sherris from pure Malaga? Take away the candle from the smoking man. By the glimmering of the left ashes he knows that he is still smoking, but he knows it only by an inference, till the restored light, coming in aid of the olfactories, reveals to both senses the full aroma. Then how he redoubles his puffs, how he burnishes! There is absolutely no such thing as reading but by a candle. We have tried the affectation of a book at noonday in gardens and in sultry arbours, but it was labour thrown away. Those gay motes in the beam come about you, hovering and teasing like so many coquettes, that will have you all to theirself, and are jealous of your abstractions. By the midnight taper the writer digests his meditations. By the same light we must approach to their perusal, if we would catch the flame, the odour. It is a mockery, all that is reported of the influential Phoebus. No true poem ever owed its birth to the sun's light. They are abstracted works, things that were born when none but the still night and his dumb candle saw his pinching throes. Marry, daylight might furnish the images, the crude material, but for the fine shapings, the true turning and filing, as mine author hath it, they must be content to hold their inspiration of the candle. The mild internal light that reveals them like fires on the domestic hearth goes out in the sunshine. Night and silence call out the starry fancies. Milton's morning hymn on Paradise, we would hold a good wager, was penned at midnight, and Taylor's richer description of a sunrise smells decidedly of the taper. Even ourself, in these our humbler lucubrations, tune our best measured cadences. Prose has her cadences, not unfrequently to the charm of the drowsier watchman, blessing the doors, or the wild sweep of winds at midnight. Even now, a loftier speculation than we have yet attempted courts our endeavours. We would indite something about the solar system. Betty, bring the candles. 16. That a sulky temper is a misfortune. We grant that it is, and a very serious one, to a man's friends, and to all that have to do with him. But whether the condition of the man himself is so much to be deplored, may admit of a question. We can speak a little to it, being ourself but lately recovered, we whisper it in confidence, reader, out of a long and desperate fit of the sullens. Was the cure a blessing? The conviction which wrought it came too clearly to leave a scruple of the fanciful injuries, for they were mere fancies, which had provoked the humour. But the humour itself was too self-pleasing while it lasted. We know how bare we lay ourselves in the confession, to be abandoned all at once with the grounds of it. We still brood over wrongs which we know to have been imaginary, and for our old acquaintance Northrop, whom we find to have been a truer friend than we took him for, we substitute some phantom, a Gaius or a Titius, as like him as we dare to form it, to wreak our yet unsatisfied resentments on. It is mortifying to fall at once from the pinnacle of neglect, to forego the idea of having been ill-used and contumaciously treated by an old friend. The first thing to aggrandize a man in his own conceit is to conceive of himself as neglected. There let him fix if he can. To undeceive him is to deprive him of the most tickling morsel within the range of self-complacency. No flattery can come near it. Happy is he who suspects his friend of an injustice, but supremely blessed who thinks all his friends in a conspiracy to depress and undervalue him. There is a pleasure, we sing not to the profane, far beyond the reach of all that the world counts joy, a deep enduring satisfaction in the depths where the superficial seek it not, of discontent. Were we to recite one half of this mystery, which we were let into by our late dissatisfaction, all the world would be in love with disrespect. We should wear a slight for a bracelet, and neglects and contumacies would be the only matter for courtship. Unlike to that mysterious book in the Apocalypse, the study of this mystery is unpalatable only in the commencement. The first sting of a suspicion is grievous, but wait, out of that wound, which to flesh and blood seems so difficult, there is balm and honey to be extracted. Your friend passed you on such or such a day, having in his company one that you conceived worse than ambiguously disposed towards you, passed you in the street without notice. To be sure he is something short sighted, and it was in your power to have accosted him, but Facts and sane inferences are trifles to a true adept in the science of dissatisfaction. He must have seen you, and Southey, who was with him, must have been the cause of the contempt. It galls you, and well it may. But have patience. Go home, and make the worst of it, and you are a made man from this time. Shut yourself up, and, rejecting as an enemy to your peace every whispering suggestion that but insinuates there may be a mistake, reflect seriously upon the many lesser instances which you had begun to perceive in proof of your friend's disaffection towards you. None of them singly was much to the purpose, but the aggregate weight is positive, and you have this last affront to clench them. Thus far the process is anything but agreeable, but now to your relief comes in the comparative faculty. You conjure up all the kind feelings you have had for your friend, what you have been to him, and what you would have been to him if he would have suffered you, how you defended him in this or that place, and his good name, his literary reputation, and so forth, was always dearer to you than your own. Your heart, spite of itself, yearns towards him. You could weep tears of blood but for a restraining pride. How say you? Do you not yet begin to apprehend a comfort, some allay of sweetness in the bitter waters? Stop not here, nor penuriously cheat yourself of your reversions. You are on vantage ground. Enlarge your speculations, and take in the rest of your friends, as a spark kindles more sparks. Was there one among them who has not to you proved hollow, false, slippery as water? Begin to think that the relation itself is inconsistent with mortality, that the very idea of friendship, with its component parts, as honour, fidelity, steadiness, exists but in your single bosom. Image yourself to yourself as the only possible friend in a world incapable of that communion. Now the gloom thickens, the little star of self-love twinkles, that is to encourage you through deeper glooms than this. You are not yet at the half-point of your elevation. You are not yet, believe me, half sulky enough. Adverting to the world in general, as these circles in the mind will spread to infinity, reflect with what strange injustice you have been treated in quarters where, setting gratitude and the expectation of friendly returns aside as chimeras, you pretended no claim beyond justice, the naked due of all men. Think the very idea of right and fit fled from the earth, or your breast the solitary receptacle of it, till you have swelled yourself into at least one hemisphere, the other being the vast Arabia stony of your friends and the world aforesaid, to grow bigger every moment in your own conceit, and the world to lessen, to deify yourself at the expense of your species, to judge the world. This is the acme and supreme point of your mystery. These the true pleasures of sulkiness. We profess no more of this grand secret than what ourself experimented on one rainy afternoon in the last week, sulking in our study. We had proceeded to the penultimate point at which the true adept seldom stops, where the consideration of benefit forgot is about to merge in the meditation of general injustice, when a knock at the door was followed by the entrance of the very friend, whose not seeing of us in the morning, for we will now confess the case our own, an accidental oversight, had given rise to so much agreeable generalization, to mortify us still more, and take down the whole flattering superstructure which pride had piled upon neglect, he had brought in his hand the identical Southey, in whose favour we had suspected him of the contumacy. Asseverations were needless, where the frank manner of them both was convictive of the injurious nature of the suspicion. We fancied that they perceived our embarrassment, but were too proud, or something else, to confess to the secret of it. We had been but too lately in the condition of the noble patient in Argos. Qui se credebat miros audire tragedos, in vacuo laetus cessor plazorque theatro, and could have exclaimed with equal reason against the friendly hands that cured us, Pol me occidistis, amici, non savastis ait, qui sic extorta voluptas, et dentus parvim mentis gratissimus error. End of Essay 24, Part 2. Essay 25 of the last Essays of Elia by Charles Lamb. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Addison. On Some of the Old Actors. London Magazine, Feb. 1822. Of all the actors who flourished in my time, a melancholy phrase if taken aright, reader, Bensley had most of the swell of soul, was greatest in the delivery of heroic conceptions, the emotions consequent upon the presentment of a great idea to the fancy. He had the true poetical enthusiasm, the rarest faculty among players. None that I remember possessed even a portion of that fine madness which he threw out in Hotspur's famous rant about glory, or the transports of the Venetian incendiary at the vision of the fired city. See footnote 1. His voice had the dissonance, and, at times, the inspiriting effect of the trumpet. His gait was uncouth and stiff, but no way embarrassed by affectation, and the thoroughbred gentleman was uppermost in every movement. He seized the moment of passion with the greatest truth, like a faithful clock, never striking before the time, never anticipating or leading you to anticipate. He was totally destitute of trick and artifice. He seemed come upon the stage to do the poet's message simply, and he did it with as genuine fidelity as the nuncios in Homer deliver the errands of the gods. He let the passion or the sentiment do its own work without prop or bolstering. He would have scorned to mountebank it, and betrayed none of that cleverness which is the bane of serious acting. For this reason his Iago was the only endurable one which I remember to have seen. No spectator from his action could divine more of his artifice than Othello was supposed to do. His confessions in soliloquy alone put you in possession of the mystery. There were no by-intimations to make the audience fancy their own discernment so much greater than that of the Moor, who commonly stands like a great helpless mark set up for mine ancient, and a quantity of barren spectators to shoot their bolts at. The Iago of Bensley did not go to work so grossly. There was a triumphant tone about the character, natural to a general consciousness of power, but none of that petty vanity which chuckles and cannot contain itself upon any little successful stroke of its knavery, which is common with your small villains and green probationers in mischief. It did not clap or crow before its time. It was not a man setting his wits at a child, and winking all the while at other children, who are mightily pleased at being let into the secret, but a consummate villain, entrapping a noble nature into toils against which no discernment was available, where the manner was as fathomless as the purpose seemed dark and without motive. The part of Malvolio in the Twelfth Night was performed by Bensley, with a richness and a dignity, of which, to judge from some recent castings of that character, the very tradition must be worn out from the stage. No manager in those days would have dreamed of giving it to Mr. Baddeley or Mr. Parsons. When Bensley was occasionally absent from the theatre, John Kemble thought it no derogation to succeed to the part. Malvolio is not essentially ludicrous. He becomes comic but by accident. He is cold, austere, repelling, but dignified, consistent, and, for what appears, rather of an overstretched morality. Maria describes him as a sort of Puritan, and he might have worn his gold chain with honour in one of our old Roundhead families, in the service of a Lambert or a Lady Fairfax. But his morality and his manners are misplaced in Illyria. He is opposed to the proper levities of the piece, and falls in the unequal contest. Still his pride, or his gravity, call it which you will, is inherent and native to the man, not mock or affected, which latter only are the fit objects to excite laughter. His quality is at the best unlovely, but neither buffoon nor contemptible. His bearing is lofty, a little above his station, but probably not much above his deserts. We see no reason why he should not have been brave, honourable, accomplished. His careless committal of the ring to the ground, which he was commissioned to restore to Cesario, bespeaks a generosity of birth and feeling. See footnote 2. His dialect on all occasions is that of a gentleman and a man of education. We must not confound him with the eternal low steward of comedy. He is master of the household to a great princess, a dignity probably conferred upon him for other respects than age or length of service. See footnote 3. Olivia, at the first indication of his supposed madness, declares that she would not have him miscarry for half of her dowry. Does this look as if the character was meant to appear little or insignificant? Once, indeed, she accuses him to his face of what? Of being sick of self-love, but with a gentleness and considerateness which could not have been, if she had not thought that this particular infirmity shaded some virtues. His rebuke to the knight and his sottish revellers is sensible and spirited, and when we take into consideration the unprotected condition of his mistress, and the strict regard with which her state of real or dissembled mourning would draw the eyes of the world upon her house affairs, Malvolio might feel the honour of the family in some sort in his keeping, as it appears not that Olivia had any more brothers or kinsmen to look to it, for Sir Toby had dropped all such nice respects at the buttery hatch. That Malvolio was meant to be represented as possessing some estimable qualities, the expression of the Duke in his anxiety to have him reconciled almost infers. Pursue him, and entreat him to a peace. Even in his abused state of chains and darkness, a sort of greatness seems never to desert him. He argues highly and well with the supposed Sir Topas, see footnote 4, and philosophizes gallantly upon his straw. There must have been some shadow of worth about the man. He must have been something more than a mere vapour, a thing of straw, or Jack in office, before Fabian and Maria could have ventured sending him upon a courting errand to Olivia. There was some consonancy, as he would say, in the undertaking, or the jest would have been too bold even for that house of misrule. There was example for it, said Malvolio. The lady of the Strachey married the yeoman of the wardrobe. Possibly, too, he might remember, for it must have happened about his time, an instance of a Duchess of Malfi, a countrywoman of Olivia's, and her equal at least, descending from her state to court her steward. The misery of them that are born great, they are forced to woo, because none dare woo them. To be sure, the lady was not very tenderly handled for it by her brothers in the sequel, but their vengeance appears to have been whetted rather by her presumption in remarrying at all, when they had meditated the keeping of her fortune in their family, than by her choice of an inferior, of Antonio's noble merits especially, for her husband. And besides, Olivia's brother was just dead. Malvolio was a man of reading, and possibly reflected upon these lines, or something like them, in his own country poetry. Ceremony has made many fools. It is as easy way unto a duchess as to a hatted dame, if her love answer, but that by timorous honours, pale respects, idle degrees of fear, men make their ways hard of themselves. 'Tis but fortune, all is fortune. Maria once told me she did affect me, and I have heard herself come thus near, that, should she fancy, it should be one of my complexion. If here was no encouragement, the devil is in it. I wish we could get at the private history of all this, between the Countess herself, serious or dissembling, for one hardly knows how to apprehend this fantastical great lady, and the practices of that delicious little piece of mischief Maria, the lime twigs laid by Machiavel the waiting maid. The man might well be rapt into a fool's paradise. Bensley threw over the part an air of Spanish loftiness. He looked, spake, and moved like an old Castilian. He was starch, spruce, opinionated, but his superstructure of pride seemed bottomed upon a sense of worth. There was something in it beyond the coxcomb. It was big and swelling, but you could not be sure that it was hollow. You might wish to see it taken down, but you felt that it was upon an elevation. He was magnificent from the outset, but when the decent sobrieties of the character began to give way, and the poison of self-love in his conceit of the Countess's affection gradually to work, you would have thought that the hero of La Mancha in person stood before you. How he went smiling to himself! With what ineffable carelessness would he twirl his gold chain! What a dream it was! You were infected with the illusion, and did not wish that it should be removed. You had no room for laughter. If an unseasonable reflection of morality obtruded itself, it was a deep sense of the pitiable infirmity of man's nature that can lay him open to such frenzies. But in truth you rather admired than pitied the lunacy while it lasted. You felt that an hour of such mistake was worth an age with the eyes open. Who would not wish to live but for a day in the conceit of such a lady's love as Olivia? Why, the Duke would have given his principality but for a quarter of a minute, sleeping or waking, to have been so deluded. The man seemed to tread upon air, to taste manna, to walk with his head in the clouds, to mate Hyperion. Oh, shake not the castles of his pride. Endure yet for a season bright moments of confidence. Stand still, ye watches of the element, that Malvolio may be still in fancy fair Olivia's lord. But fate and retribution say no. I hear the mischievous titter of Maria, the witty taunts of Sir Toby, the still more insupportable triumph of the foolish knight. The counterfeit Sir Topaz is unmasked, and thus the whirligig of time, as the true clown hath it, brings in his revenges. I confess that I never saw the catastrophe of this character while Bensley played it, without a kind of tragic interest. There was good foolery too. Few now remember Dodd. What an ague-cheek the stage lost in him! Lovegrove, who came nearest to the old actors, revived the character some few seasons ago, and made it sufficiently grotesque. But Dodd was it, as it came out of nature's hands. It might be said to remain in puris naturalibus. In expressing slowness of apprehension, this actor surpassed all others. You could see the first dawn of an idea stealing slowly over his countenance, climbing up by little and little with a painful process, till it cleared up at last to the fulness of a twilight conception, its highest meridian. He seemed to keep back his intellect, as some have had the power to retard their pulsation. The balloon takes less time in filling than it took to cover the expansion of his broad moony face over all its quarters with expression. A glimmer of understanding would appear in a corner of his eye, and for lack of fuel, go out again. A part of his forehead would catch a little intelligence, and be a long time in communicating it to the remainder. I am ill at dates, but I think it is now better than 25 years ago that, walking in the gardens of Gray's Inn, they were then far finer than they are now, the accursed Verulam bridges had not encroached upon all the east side of them, cutting out delicate green crankles, and shouldering away one or two of the stately alcoves of the terrace. The survivor stands gaping and relationless, as if it remembered its brother. They are still the best gardens of any of the Inns of Court, my beloved Temple not forgotten. Have the gravest character, their aspect being altogether reverend and law-breathing. Bacon has left the impress of his foot upon their gravel walks. Taking my afternoon solace on a summer day upon the aforesaid terrace, a comely, sad personage came towards me, whom from his grave air and deportment I judged to be one of the old benchers of the inn. He had a serious thoughtful forehead, and seemed to be in meditations of mortality. As I have an instinctive awe of old benchers, I was passing him with that sort of sub-indicative token of respect which one is apt to demonstrate towards a venerable stranger, and which rather denotes an inclination to greet him than any positive motion of the body to that effect, a species of humility and will-worship, which I observe 9 times out of 10 rather puzzles than pleases the person it is offered to, when the face, turning full upon me, strangely identified itself with that of Dodd. Upon close inspection I was not mistaken. But could this sad, thoughtful countenance be the same vacant face of folly which I had hailed so often under circumstances of gaiety, which I had never seen without a smile, or recognized but as the usher of mirth, that looked out so formally flat in Foppington, so frothily pert in tattle, so impotently busy in backbite, so blankly divested of all meaning, or resolutely expressive of none, in acres, in fribble, and 1,000 agreeable impertinences? Was this the face, full of thought and carefulness, that had so often divested itself at will of every trace of either, to give me diversion, to clear my cloudy face for 2 or 3 hours at least of its furrows? Was this the face, manly, sober, intelligent, which I had so often despised, made mocks at, made merry with? The remembrance of the freedoms which I had taken with it came upon me with a reproach of insult. I could have asked it pardon. I thought it looked upon me with a sense of injury. There is something strange as well as sad in seeing actors, your pleasant fellows particularly, subjected to and suffering the common lot. Their fortunes, their casualties, their deaths, seem to belong to the scene, their actions to be amenable to poetic justice only. We can hardly connect them with more awful responsibilities. The death of this fine actor took place shortly after this meeting. He had quitted the stage some months, and, as I learned afterwards, had been in the habit of resorting daily to these gardens almost to the day of his decease. In these serious walks, probably he was divesting himself of many scenic and some real vanities, weaning himself from the frivolities of the lesser and the greater theatre, doing gentle penance for a life of no very reprehensible fooleries, taking off by degrees the buffoon mask which he might feel he had worn too long, and rehearsing for a more solemn cast of part. Dying, he put on the weeds of Dominic. See footnote 5. The elder Palmer, of stage-treading celebrity, commonly played Sir Toby in those days, but there is a solidity of wit in the jests of that half Falstaff which he did not quite fill out. He was as much too showy as Moody, who sometimes took the part, was dry and sottish. In sock or buskin there was an air of swaggering gentility about Jack Palmer. He was a gentleman, with a slight infusion of the footman. His brother Bob, of recenter memory, who was his shadow in everything while he lived, and dwindled into less than a shadow afterwards, was a gentleman with a little stronger infusion of the latter ingredient. That was all. It is amazing how a little of the more or less makes a difference in these things. When you saw Bobby in The Duke's Servant, see footnote 6, you said, "What a pity such a pretty fellow was only a servant." When you saw Jack figuring in Captain Absolute, you thought you could trace his promotion to some lady of quality who fancied the handsome fellow in his top-knot, and had bought him a commission. Therefore Jack, in Dick Amlet, was insuperable. Jack had two voices, both plausible, hypocritical, and insinuating, but his secondary or supplemental voice still more decisively histrionic than his common one. It was reserved for the spectator, and the dramatis personae were supposed to know nothing at all about it. The lies of young Wilding and the sentiments in Joseph's Surface were thus marked out in a sort of italics to the audience. This secret correspondence with the company before the curtain, which is the bane and death of tragedy, has an extremely happy effect in some kinds of comedy, in the more highly artificial comedy of Congreve, or of Sheridan especially, where the absolute sense of reality, so indispensable to scenes of interest, is not required, or would rather interfere to diminish your pleasure. The fact is, you do not believe in such characters as Surface, the villain of artificial comedy, even while you read or see them. If you did, they would shock and not divert you. When Ben, in Love for Love, returns from sea, the following exquisite dialogue occurs at his first meeting with his father. Sir Samson. Thou hast been many a weary league, Ben, since I saw thee. Ben. Ay, been far enough, and that be all. Well, father, and how do all at home? How does brother Dick and brother Val? Sir Sampson. Dick? Body o' me! Dick has been dead these 2 years. I writ you word when you were at Leghorn. Ben. Mess, that's true. Marry, I had forgot. Dick's dead, as you say. Well, and how? I have a many questions to ask you. Here is an instance of insensibility which, in real life, would be revolting, or rather, in real life, could not have coexisted with the warm-hearted temperament of the character. But when you read it in the spirit with which such playful selections and specious combinations rather than strict metaphrases of nature should be taken, or when you saw Bannister play it, it neither did nor does wound the moral sense at all. For what is Ben, the pleasant sailor which Bannister gave us, but a piece of a satire, a creation of Congreve's fancy, a dreamy combination of all the accidents of a sailor's character, his contempt of money, his credulity to women, with that necessary estrangement from home which it is just within the verge of credibility to suppose might produce such an hallucination as is here described. We never think the worse of Ben for it, or feel it as a stain upon his character. But when an actor comes, and instead of the delightful phantom, the creature dear to half-belief, which Bannister exhibited, displays before our eyes a downright concretion of a whopping sailor, a jolly warm-hearted Jack Tar, and nothing else, when, instead of investing it with a delicious confoundedness of the head, and a veering, undirected goodness of purpose, he gives to it a downright daylight understanding, and a full consciousness of its actions, thrusting forward the sensibilities of the character with a pretence as if it stood upon nothing else, and was to be judged by them alone. We feel the discord of the thing. The scene is disturbed. A real man has got in among the dramatis personae, and puts them out. We want the sailor turned out. We feel that his true place is not behind the curtain, but in the first or second gallery. To be resumed occasionally. Elia. Footnote 1. How lovelily the Adriatic whore, dressed in her flames, will shine, devouring flames, such as will burn her to her watery bottom, and hiss in her foundation. Pierre, in Venice Preserved. Footnote 2. Viola. She took the ring from me, I'll none of it. Malvolio. Come, sir, you peevishly threw it to her, and her will is, it should be so returned. If it be worth stooping for, there it lies in your eye. If not, be it his that finds it. Footnote 3. Mrs. Inchbald seems to have fallen into the common mistake of the character in some sensible observations otherwise upon this comedy. It might be asked, she says, whether this credulous steward was much deceived in imputing a degraded taste in the sentiments of love to his fair lady Olivia, as she actually did fall in love with a domestic, and one who, from his extreme youth, was perhaps a greater reproach to her discretion than had she cast a tender regard upon her old and faithful servant. But where does she gather the fact of his age? Neither Maria nor Fabian ever cast that reproach upon him. Footnote 4. Clown. What is the opinion of Pythagoras concerning wildfowl? Malvolio. That the soul of our grandam might haply inhabit a bird. Clown. What thinkest thou of his opinion? Malvolio. I think nobly of the soul, and no way approve of his opinion. Footnote 5. Dodd was a man of reading, and left at his death a choice collection of old English literature. I should judge him to have been a man of wit. I know one instance of an impromptu, which no length of study could have bettered. My merry friend Jem White had seen him one evening in Ague Cheek, and recognizing Dodd the next day in Fleet Street, was irresistibly impelled to take off his hat and salute him as the identical knight of the preceding evening, with a "Save you, Sir Andrew." Dodd, not at all disconcerted at this unusual address from a stranger, with a courteous half-rebuking wave of the hand, put him off with an "Away, fool." Footnote 6. High life below stairs. End of Essay 25. Essay 26 of the last essays of Elia by Charles Lamb. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Addison. The Old Actors. London Magazine, April 1822. The artificial comedy, or comedy of manners, is quite extinct on our stage. Congreve and Farquhar show their heads once in 7 years, only to be exploded and put down instantly. The times cannot bear them. Is it for a few wild speeches, an occasional license of dialogue? I think not altogether. The business of their dramatic characters will not stand the moral test. We screw everything up to that. Idle gallantry in a fiction, a dream, the passing pageant of an evening, startles us in the same way as the alarming indications of profligacy in a son or ward in real life should startle a parent or guardian. We have no such middle emotions as dramatic interests left. We see a stage libertine playing his loose pranks of 2 hours' duration, and of no after consequence, with the severe eyes which inspect real vices with their bearings upon 2 worlds. We are spectators to a plot or intrigue, not reducible in life to the point of strict morality, and take it all for truth. We substitute a real for a dramatic person, and judge him accordingly. We try him in our courts, from which there is no appeal to the dramatis personae, his peers. We have been spoiled with, not sentimental comedy, but a tyrant far more pernicious to our pleasures, which has succeeded to it, the exclusive and all-devouring drama of common life, where the moral point is everything, where, instead of the fictitious, half-believed personages of the stage, the phantoms of old comedy, we recognize ourselves, our brothers, aunts, kinsfolk, allies, patrons, enemies, the same as in life, with an interest in what is going on so hearty and substantial that we cannot afford our moral judgment in its deepest and most vital results to compromise or slumber for a moment. What is there transacting, by no modification is made to affect us in any other manner than the same events or characters would do in our relationships of life. We carry our fireside concerns to the theatre with us. We do not go thither, like our ancestors, to escape from the pressure of reality, so much as to confirm our experience of it, to make assurance double, and take a bond of fate. We must live our toilsome lives twice over, as it was the mournful privilege of Ulysses to descend twice to the shades. All that neutral ground of character which stood between vice and virtue, or which, in fact, was indifferent to neither, where neither properly was called in question, that happy breathing place from the burden of a perpetual moral questioning, the sanctuary and quiet Alsatia of hunted casuistry, is broken up and disfranchised as injurious to the interests of society. The privileges of the place are taken away by law. We dare not dally with images or names of wrong. We bark like foolish dogs at shadows. We dread infection from the scenic representation of disorder, and fear a painted pustule. In our anxiety that our morality should not take cold, we wrap it up in a great blanket surtout of precaution against the breeze and sunshine. I confess for myself that, with no great delinquencies to answer for, I am glad for a season to take an airing beyond the diocese of the strict conscience, not to live always in the precincts of the law courts, but now and then, for a dream while or so, to imagine a world with no meddling restrictions, to get into recesses whither the hunter cannot follow me. Secret shades of woody Ida's inmost grove, while yet there was no fear of Jove. I come back to my cage and my restraint, the fresher and more healthy for it. I wear my shackles more contentedly, for having respired the breath of an imaginary freedom. I do not know how it is with others, but I feel the better always for the perusal of one of Congreve's, nay, why should I not add, even of Wycherley's comedies? I am the gayer at least for it, and I could never connect those sports of a witty fancy in any shape with any result to be drawn from them to imitation in real life. They are a world of themselves almost as much as a fairyland. Take one of their characters, male or female, with few exceptions they are alike, and place it in a modern play, and my virtuous indignation shall rise against the profligate wretch as warmly as the Catos of the pit could desire, because in a modern play I am to judge of right and wrong, and the standard of police is the measure of poetical justice. The atmosphere will blight it. It cannot thrive here. It is got into a moral world where it has no business, from which it must needs fall headlong, as dizzy and incapable of keeping its stand as a Swedenborgian bad spirit that has wandered unawares within the sphere of one of his good men or angels. But in its own world, do we feel the creature is so very bad? The Fainalls and the Mirabells, the Dorimants and Lady Touchwoods, in their own sphere, do not offend my moral sense, or, in fact, appeal to it at all. They seem engaged in their proper element. They break through no laws, or conscientious restraints. They know of none. They have got out of Christendom into the land, what shall I call it, of cuckoldry, the Utopia of gallantry, where pleasure is duty, and the manners perfect freedom. It is altogether a speculative scene of things, which has no reference whatever to the world that is. No good person can be justly offended as a spectator, because no good person suffers on the stage. Judged morally, every character in these plays, the few exceptions only are mistakes, is alike essentially vain and worthless. The great art of Congreve is especially shown in this, that he has entirely excluded from his scenes (some little generosities in the part of Angelica perhaps excepted) not only anything like a faultless character, but any pretensions to goodness or good feelings whatsoever. Whether he did this designedly or instinctively, the effect is as happy as the design, if design, was bold. I used to wonder at the strange power which his way of the world in particular possesses of interesting you all along in the pursuits of characters for whom you absolutely care nothing, for you neither hate nor love his personages, and I think it is owing to this very indifference for any that you endure the whole. He has spread a privation of moral light, I will call it, rather than by the ugly name of palpable darkness, over his creations, and his shadows flit before you without distinction or preference. Had he introduced a good character, a single gush of moral feeling, a revulsion of the judgment to actual life and actual duties, the impertinent Goshen would have only lighted to the discovery of deformities which now are none, because we think them none. Translated into real life, the characters of his and his friend Wycherley's dramas are profligates and strumpets, the business of their brief existence the undivided pursuit of lawless gallantry. No other spring of action or possible motive of conduct is recognized. Principles which, universally acted upon, must reduce this frame of things to a chaos. But we do them wrong in so translating them. No such effects are produced in their world. When we are among them, we are amongst a chaotic people. We are not to judge them by our usages. No reverend institutions are insulted by their proceedings, for they have none among them. No peace of families is violated, for no family ties exist among them. No purity of the marriage bed is stained, for none is supposed to have a being. No deep affections are disquieted, no holy wedlock bands are snapped asunder, for affection's depth and wedded faith are not of the growth of that soil. There is neither right nor wrong, gratitude or its opposite, claim or duty, paternity or sonship. Of what consequence is it to virtue, or how is she at all concerned about it, whether Sir Simon or Dapperwit steal away Miss Martha, or who is the father of Lord Froth's or Sir Paul Pliant's children? The whole is a passing pageant, where we should sit as unconcerned at the issues for life or death as at a battle of the frogs and mice. But like Don Quixote, we take part against the puppets, and quite as impertinently. We dare not contemplate an Atlantis, a scheme out of which our coxcombical moral sense is for a little transitory ease excluded. We have not the courage to imagine a state of things for which there is neither reward nor punishment. We cling to the painful necessities of shame and blame. We would indict our very dreams. Amidst the mortifying circumstances attendant upon growing old, it is something to have seen the School for Scandal in its glory. This comedy grew out of Congreve and Wycherley, but gathered some allays of the sentimental comedy which followed theirs. It is impossible that it should be now acted, though it continues at long intervals to be announced in the bills. Its hero, when Palmer played it at least, was Joseph Surface. When I remember the gay boldness, the graceful, solemn plausibility, the measured step, the insinuating voice, to express it in a word, the downright acted villainy of the part, so different from the pressure of conscious actual wickedness, the hypocritical assumption of hypocrisy, which made Jack so deservedly a favourite in that character, I must needs conclude the present generation of playgoers more virtuous than myself, or more dense. I freely confess that he divided the palm with me with his better brother, that, in fact, I liked him quite as well. Not but there are passages, like that, for instance, where Joseph is made to refuse a pittance to a poor relation, incongruities which Sheridan was forced upon by the attempt to join the artificial with the sentimental comedy, either of which must destroy the other. But over these obstructions Jack's manner floated him so lightly, that a refusal from him no more shocked you than the easy compliance of Charles gave you in reality any pleasure. You got over the paltry question as quickly as you could, to get back into the regions of pure comedy, where no cold moral reigns. The highly artificial manner of Palmer in this character counteracted every disagreeable impression which you might have received from the contrast, supposing them real, between the two brothers. You did not believe in Joseph with the same faith with which you believed in Charles. The latter was a pleasant reality, the former a no less pleasant poetical foil to it. The comedy, I have said, is incongruous, a mixture of Congreve with sentimental incompatibilities. The gaiety, upon the whole, is buoyant, but it required the consummate art of Palmer to reconcile the discordant elements. A player with Jack's talents, if we had one now, would not dare to do the part in the same manner. He would instinctively avoid every turn which might tend to unrealize and so to make the character fascinating. He must take his cue from his spectators, who would expect a bad man and a good man as rigidly opposed to each other as the death-bed of those geniuses are contrasted in The Prince, which I am sorry to see have disappeared from the windows of my old friend Carrington Bowles, of St. Paul's Churchyard memory. An exhibition as venerable as the adjacent cathedral, and almost coeval, of the bad and good man at the hour of death, where the ghastly apprehensions of the former, and truly the grim phantom with his reality of a toasting-fork is not to be despised, so finely contrast with the meek, complacent kissing of the rod, taking it in like honey and butter, with which the latter submits to the scythe of the gentle bleeder Time, who wields his lancet with the apprehensive finger of a popular young lady's surgeon. What flesh, like loving grass, would not covet to meet half-way the stroke of such a delicate mower? John Palmer was twice an actor in this exquisite part. He was playing to you all the while that he was playing upon Sir Peter and his lady. You had the first intimation of a sentiment before it was on his lips. His altered voice was meant to you, and you were to suppose that his factitious co-flutterers on the stage perceived nothing at all of it. What was it to you if that half-reality, the husband, was overreached by the puppetry, or the thin thing, Lady Teazle's reputation, was persuaded it was dying of a plethory? The fortunes of Othello and Desdemona were not concerned in it. Poor Jack has passed from the stage in good time that he did not live to this our age of seriousness. The fidgety, pleasant old Teazle King, too, is gone in good time. His manner would scarce have passed current in our day. We must love or hate, acquit or condemn, censure or pity, exert our detestable coxcombry of moral judgment upon everything. Joseph Surface, to go down now, must be a downright revolting villain, no compromise. His first appearance must shock and give horror. His specious plausibilities, which the pleasurable faculties of our fathers welcomed with such hearty greetings, knowing that no harm, dramatic harm even, could come, or was meant to come of them, must inspire a cold and killing aversion. Charles, the real canting person of the scene, for the hypocrisy of Joseph has its ulterior legitimate ends, but his brother's professions of a good heart centre in downright self-satisfaction, must be loved, and Joseph hated. To balance one disagreeable reality with another, Sir Peter Teazle must be no longer the comic idea of a fretful old bachelor bridegroom, whose teasings, while King acted it, were evidently as much played off at you as they were meant to concern anybody on the stage. He must be a real person, capable in law of sustaining an injury, a person towards whom duties are to be acknowledged, the genuine crim-con antagonist of the villainous seducer Joseph. To realize him more, his sufferings under his unfortunate match must have the downright pungency of life, must, or should, make you not mirthful but uncomfortable, just as the same predicament would move you in a neighbour or old friend. The delicious scenes which give the play its name and zest must affect you in the same serious manner, as if you heard the reputation of a dear female friend attacked in your real presence. Crabtree and Sir Benjamin, those poor snakes that lived but in the sunshine of your mirth, must be ripened by this hot-bed process of realization into asps or amphisbaenas, and Mrs. Candour, oh frightful, become a hooded serpent. Or who that remembers Parsons and Dodd, the wasp and butterfly of the school for scandal in those two characters, and charming, natural Miss Pope, the perfect gentlewoman, as distinguished from the fine lady of comedy in this latter part, would forego the true scenic delight, the escape from life, the oblivion of consequences, the holiday barring out of the pedant reflection, those saturnalia of 2 or 3 brief hours well won from the world, to sit instead at one of our modern plays, to have his coward conscience, that forsooth must not be left for a moment, stimulated with perpetual appeals, dulled rather and blunted, as a faculty without repose must be, and his moral vanity pampered with images of notional justice, notional beneficence, lives saved without the spectator's risk, and fortunes given away that cost the author nothing. No piece was, perhaps, ever so completely cast in all its parts as this manager's comedy. Miss Farren had succeeded to Mrs. Abingdon in Lady Teazle, and Smith, the original Charles, had retired when I first saw it. The rest of the characters, with very slight exceptions, remained. I remember it was then the fashion to cry down John Kemble, who took the part of Charles after Smith, but I thought very unjustly. Smith, I fancy, was more airy, and took the eye with a certain gaiety of person. He brought with him no sombre recollections of tragedy. He had not to expiate the fault of having pleased beforehand in lofty declamation. He had no sins of Hamlet or of Richard to atone for. His failure in these parts was a passport to success in one of so opposite a tendency. But as far as I could judge, the weighty sense of Kemble made up for more personal incapacity than he had to answer for. His harshest tones in this part came steeped and dulcified in good humour. He made his defects a grace. His exact declamatory manner, as he managed it, only served to convey the points of his dialogue with more precision. It seemed to head the shafts, to carry them deeper. Not one of his sparkling sentences was lost. I remember minutely how he delivered each in succession, and cannot by any effort imagine how any of them could be altered for the better. No man could deliver brilliant dialogue, the dialogue of Congreve or of Wycherley, because none understood it, half so well as John Kemble. His Valentine in Love for Love was to my recollection faultless. He flagged sometimes in the intervals of tragic passion. He would slumber over the level parts of an heroic character. His Macbeth has been known to nod. But he always seemed to me to be particularly alive to pointed and witty dialogue. The relaxing levities of tragedy have not been touched by any since him. The playful court-bred spirit in which he condescended to the players in Hamlet, the sportive relief which he threw into the darker shades of Richard, disappeared with him. Tragedy is become a uniform dead weight. They have fastened lead to her buskins. She never pulls them off for the ease of a moment. To invert a commonplace from Niobe, she never forgets herself to liquefaction. John had his sluggish moods, his torpors, but they were the halting stones and resting places of his tragedy, politic savings and fetches of the breath, husbandry of the lungs, where nature appointed him to be an economist rather, I think, than errors of the judgment. They were, at worst, less painful than the eternal, tormenting, unappeasable vigilance, the lidless dragon eyes of present fashionable tragedy. The story of his swallowing opium pills to keep him lively upon the first night of a certain tragedy, we may presume to be a piece of retaliatory pleasantry on the part of the suffering author. But indeed John had the art of diffusing a complacent, equable dulness, which you knew not where to quarrel with, over a piece which he did not like, beyond any of his contemporaries. John Kemble had made up his mind early that all the good tragedies which could be written had been written, and he resented any new attempt. His shelves were full. The old standards were scope enough for his ambition. He ranged in them absolute, and fair in Otway, full in Shakespeare shone. He succeeded to the old lawful thrones, and did not care to adventure bottomry with a Sir Edward Mortimer, or any casual speculator that offered. I remember, too acutely for my peace, the deadly extinguisher which he put upon my friend G.'s Antonio. G., satiate with visions of political justice, possibly not to be realized in our time, or willing to let the sceptical worldling see that his anticipations of the future did not preclude a warm sympathy for men as they are and have been, wrote a tragedy. He chose a story affecting, romantic, Spanish, the plot simple without being naked, the incidents uncommon without being overstrained. Antonio, who gives the name to the piece, is a sensitive young Castilian who, in a fit of his country honour, immolates his sister. But I must not anticipate the catastrophe. The play, reader, is extant in choice English, and you will employ a spare half-crown not injudiciously in the quest of it. The conception was bold, and the dénouement, the time and place in which the hero of it existed, considered, not much out of keeping. Yet it must be confessed that it required a delicacy of handling, both from the author and the performer, so as not much to shock the prejudices of a modern English audience. G., in my opinion, had done his part. John, who was in familiar habits with the philosopher, had undertaken to play Antonio. great expectations were formed. A philosopher's first play was a new era. The night arrived. I was favoured with a seat in an advantageous box, between the author and his friend M. G. sat cheerful and confident. In his friend M.'s looks, who had perused the manuscript, I read some terror. Antonio, in the person of John Philip Kemble, at length appeared, starched out in a ruff which no one could dispute, and in most irreproachable mustachios. John always dressed most provokingly correct on these occasions. The first act swept by, solemn and silent. It went off, as G. assured M., exactly as the opening act of a piece, the protasis, should do. The cue of the spectators was to be mute. The characters were but in their introduction. The passions and the incidents would be developed hereafter. Applause hitherto would be impertinent. Silent attention was the effect all desirable. Poor M. acquiesced, but in his honest friendly face I could discern a working which told how much more acceptable the plaudit of a single hand, however misplaced, would have been than all this reasoning. The second act, as in duty bound, rose a little in interest, but still John kept his forces under, in policy, as G. would have it, and the audience were most complacently attentive. The protasis, in fact, was scarcely unfolded. The interest would warm in the next act, against which a special incident was provided. M. wiped his cheek, flushed with a friendly perspiration. 'Tis M.'s way of showing his zeal. From every pore of him a perfume falls. I honour it above Alexander's. He had once or twice, during this act, joined his palms in a feeble endeavour to elicit a sound. They emitted a solitary noise, without an echo. There was no deep to answer to his deep. G. repeatedly begged him to be quiet. The third act at length brought on the scene which was to warm the piece progressively to the final flaming forth of the catastrophe. A philosophic calm settled upon the clear brow of G. as it approached. The lips of M. quivered. A challenge was held forth upon the stage, and there was promise of a fight. The pit roused themselves on this extraordinary occasion, and, as their manner is, seemed disposed to make a ring, when suddenly Antonio, who was the challenged, turning the tables upon the hot challenger, Don Guzman, who, by the way, should have had his sister, balks his humour, and the pit's reasonable expectation at the same time, with some speeches out of the new philosophy against duelling. The audience were here fairly caught. Their courage was up and on the alert. A few blows, ding dong, as R. the dramatist afterwards expressed it to me, might have done the business, when their most exquisite moral sense was suddenly called in to assist in the mortifying negation of their own pleasure. They could not applaud for disappointment. They would not condemn for morality's sake. The interest stood stone still, and John's manner was not at all calculated to unpetrify it. It was Christmas time, and the atmosphere furnished some pretext for asthmatic affections. One began to cough, his neighbour sympathized with him, till a cough became epidemical. But when, from being half artificial in the pit, the cough got frightfully naturalized among the fictitious persons of the drama, and Antonio himself, albeit it was not set down in the stage directions, seemed more intent upon relieving his own lungs than the distresses of the author and his friends. Then G. first knew fear, and mildly turning to M., intimated that he had not been aware that Mr. K. laboured under a cold, and that the performance might possibly have been postponed with advantage for some nights further, still keeping the same serene countenance, while M. sweat like a bull. It would be invidious to pursue the fates of this ill-starred evening. In vain did the plot thicken in the scenes that followed. In vain the dialogue wax more passionate and stirring, and the progress of the sentiment point more and more clearly to the arduous development which impended. In vain the action was accelerated, while the acting stood still. From the beginning John had taken his stand, had wound himself up to an even tenor of stately declamation, from which no exigence of dialogue or person could make him swerve for an instant. To dream of his rising with the scene, the common trick of tragedians, was preposterous, for from the onset he had planted himself as upon a terrace, on an eminence vastly above the audience, and he kept that sublime level to the end. He looked from his throne of elevated sentiment upon the underworld of spectators with a most sovereign and becoming contempt. There was excellent pathos delivered out to them, and they would receive it so, and they would not receive it so. There was no offence against decorum in all this, nothing to condemn, to damn. Not an irreverent symptom of a sound was to be heard. The procession of verbiage stalked on through 4 and 5 acts, no one venturing to predict what would come of it, when towards the winding up of the latter, Antonio, with an irrelevancy that seemed to stagger Elvira herself, for she had been coolly arguing the point of honour with him, suddenly whips out a poniard and stabs his sister to the heart. The effect was as if a murder had been committed in cold blood. The whole house rose up in clamorous indignation, demanding justice. The feeling rose far above hisses. I believe at that instant, if they could have got him, they would have torn the unfortunate author to pieces. Not that the act itself was so exorbitant, or of a complexion different from what they themselves would have applauded upon another occasion in a Brutus or an Appius, but for want of attending to Antonio's words, which palpably led to the expectation of no less dire an event, instead of being seduced by his manner, which seemed to promise a sleep of a less alarming nature than it was his cue to inflict upon Elvira, they found themselves betrayed into an accomplishship of murder, a perfect misprision of parricide, while they dreamed of nothing less. M, I believe, was the only person who suffered acutely from the failure, for G thenceforward, with a serenity unattainable but by the true philosophy, abandoning a precarious popularity, retired into his fast hold of speculation. The drama, in which the world was to be his tiring-room, and remote posterity his applauding spectators at once and actors. Elia. End of Essay 26. Essay 27 of the Last Essays of Elia by Charles Lamb. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Addison. The Old Actors. London Magazine, October 1822. I do not know a more mortifying thing than to be conscious of a foregone delight, with a total oblivion of the person and manner which conveyed it. In dreams I often stretch and strain after the countenance of Edwin, whom I once saw in Peeping Tom. I cannot catch a feature of him. He is no more to me than Noakes or Pinkethman. Parsons, and still more Dodd, were near being lost to me, till I was refreshed with their portraits' fine treat the other day at Mr. Matthews's gallery at Highgate, which, with the exception of the Hogarth pictures a few years since exhibited in Pall Mall, was the most delightful collection I ever gained admission to. There hang the players in their single persons and in grouped scenes from the Restoration. Bettertons, Booths, Garricks, justifying the prejudices which we entertain for them, the Bracegirdles, the Mountforts, and the Oldfields, fresh as Cibber has described them, the Woffington, a true Hogarth, upon a couch, dallying and dangerous, the screen scene in Brinsley's famous comedy with Smith and Mrs. Abingdon, whom I have not seen, and the rest whom, having seen, I see still there. There is Henderson, unrivalled in Comus, whom I saw at second hand in the elder Harley. Harley, the rival of Holman in Horatio. Holman, with the bright glittering teeth in Lothario, and the deep Pavois sighs in Romeo, the jolliest person (our son is fat) of any Hamlet I have yet seen, with the most laudable attempts for a personable man at looking melancholy, and Pope, the abdicated monarch of tragedy and comedy in Harry the Eighth and Lord Townley. There hang the two Aikins, brethren in mediocrity, Wroughton, who in Kitely seemed to have forgotten that in prouder days he had personated Alexander, the specious form of John Palmer, with the special effrontery of Bobby, Bensley, with the trumpet tongue, and little Quick, the retired Dioclesian of Islington, with his squeak like a Bartholomew fiddle. There are fixed, cold as in life, the immovable features of Moody, who, afraid of o'erstepping nature, sometimes stopped short of her, and the restless fidgetiness of Lewis, who, with no such fears, not seldom leaped o'er the other side. There hang Farren and Whitfield, and Burton and Phillimore, names of small account in those times, but which, remembered now, or casually recalled by the sight of an old playbill, with their associated recordations, can drown an eye unused to flow. There too hangs, not far removed from them in death, the graceful plainness of the first Mrs. Pope, with a voice unstrung by age, but which in her better days must have competed with the silver tones of Barry himself, so enchanting in decay do I remember it. Of all her lady parts, exceeding herself in the Lady Quakeress, there earth touched heaven, of O'Keefe, when she played it to the merry cousin of Lewis. And Mrs. Mattox, the sensiblest of viragos, and Miss Pope, a gentlewoman ever, to the verge of ungentility, with Churchill's compliment still burnishing upon her gay honeycomb lips. There are the two Bannisters, and Sedgwick, and Kelly, and Dignam Diggy, and the bygone features of Mrs. Ward, matchless in Lady Loverule, and the collective majesty of the whole Kemble family, and Shakespeare's woman, Dora Jordan, and by her two antics, who in former and in latter days have chiefly beguiled us of our griefs, whose portraits we shall strive to recall, for the sympathy of those who may not have had the benefit of viewing the matchless Highgate collection. Mr. Suett. Oh, for a slipshod muse, to celebrate in numbers, loose and shambling as himself, the merits and the person of Mr. Richard Suett, comedian. Richard, or rather Dicky Suett, for so in his lifetime he was best pleased to be called, and time hath ratified the appellation, lieth buried on the north side of the cemetery of Holy Paul, to whose service his nonage and tender years were set apart and dedicated. There are who do yet remember him at that period, his pipe clear and harmonious. He would often speak of his chorister days, when he was a cherub Dicky. What clipped his wings, or made it expedient that he should exchange the holy for the profane state, whether he had lost his good voice, his best recommendation to that office, like Sir John, with hallooing and singing of anthems, or whether he was adjudged to lack something, even in those early years, of the gravity indispensable to an occupation which professeth to commerce with the skies, I could never rightly learn. But we find him, after the probation of a 12-month or so, reverting to a secular condition, and become one of us. I think he was not altogether of that timber out of which cathedral seats and sounding-boards are hewed. But if a glad heart, kind and therefore glad, be any part of sanctity, then might the robe of motley, with which he invested himself with so much humility after his deprivation, and which he wore so long with so much blameless satisfaction to himself and to the public, be accepted for a surplice, his white stole and alb. The first fruits of his secularization was an engagement upon the boards of Old Drury, at which theatre he commenced, as I have been told, with adopting the manner of parsons in old men's characters. At the period in which most of us knew him, he was no more an imitator than he was in any true sense himself imitable. He was the Robin Goodfellow of the stage. He came in to trouble all things with a welcome perplexity, himself no whit troubled for the matter. He was known, like Puck, by his note, ha ha ha, sometimes deepening to ho ho ho, with an irresistible accession, derived perhaps remotely from his ecclesiastical education, foreign to his prototype of "Oh, la!" Thousands of hearts yet respond to the chuckling "Oh, la!" of Dicky Suett, brought back to their remembrance by the faithful transcript of his friend Matthews's mimicry. The force of nature could no further go. He drawled upon the stock of these two syllables, richer than the cuckoo. Care that troubles all the world was forgotten in his composition. Had he had but 2 grains, nay, half a grain of it, he could never have supported himself upon those 2 spider strings which served him in the latter part of his unmixed existence as legs. A doubt or a scruple must have made him totter, a sigh have puffed him down, the weight of a frown had staggered him, a wrinkle made him lose his balance. But on he went, scrambling upon those airy stilts of his, with Robin Goodfellow, Thoroughbrake, Thoroughbriar, reckless of a scratched face or a torn doublet. Shakespeare foresaw him when he framed his fools and jesters. They have all the true Suett stamp, a loose gait, a slippery tongue, this last the ready midwife to a without pain delivered jest, in words light as air, venting truths deep as the centre, with idlest rhymes tagging conceit when busiest, singing with Lear in the Tempest, or Sir Toby at the buttery hatch. Jack Bannister and he had the fortune to be more of personal favourites with the town than any actors before or after. The difference, I take it, was this: Jack was more beloved for his sweet, good-natured, moral pretensions. Dicky was more liked for his sweet, good-natured, no pretensions at all. Your whole conscience stirred with Bannister's performance of Walter in The Children in the Wood. How dearly beautiful it was! But Dicky seemed like a thing, as Shakespeare says of love, too young to know what conscience is. He put us into Vester's days. Evil fled before him, not as from Jack, as from an antagonist, but because it could not touch him, any more than a cannon-ball a fly. He was delivered from the burthen of that death, and when death came himself, not in metaphor, to fetch Dicky, it is recorded of him by Robert Palmer, who kindly watched his exit, that he received the last stroke, neither varying his accustomed tranquillity nor tune, with the simple exclamation, worthy to have been recorded in his epitaph, "Oh la! Oh la, Bobby!" Mr. Munden. Not many nights ago we had come home from seeing this extraordinary performer in Cockletop, and when we retired to our pillow, his whimsical visage still stuck by us in a manner as to threaten sleep. In vain we tried to divest ourselves of it by conjuring up the most opposite associations. We resolved to be serious, We raised up the gravest topics of life, private misery, public calamity, all would not do. There the antic sat, mocking our state. His queer visnomy, his bewildering costume, all the strange things which he had raked together, his serpentine rod swagging about in his pocket, Cleopatra's tear, and the rest of his relics, O'Keefe's wild farce, and his wilder commentary, till the passion of laughter, like grief in excess, relieved itself by its own weight, inviting the sleep which in the first instance it had driven away. But we were not to escape so easily. No sooner did we fall into slumbers than the same image, only more perplexing, assailed us in the shape of dreams. Not one Munden, but 500 were dancing before us, like the faces which, whether you will or no, come when you have been taking opium. All the strange combinations which this strangest of all strange mortals ever shot his proper countenance into, from the day he came commissioned to dry up the tears of the town for the loss of the now almost forgotten Edwin. Oh, for the power of the pencil to have fixed them when we awoke! A season or two since there was exhibited a Hogarth gallery. We do not see where there should not be a Munden gallery. In richness and variety the latter would not fall far short of the former. There is one face of Farley, one face of Knight, one face, but what a one it is, of Liston. But Munden has none that you can properly pin down and call his. When you think he has exhausted his battery of looks in unaccountable warfare with your gravity, suddenly he sprouts out an entirely new set of features, like Hydra. He is not one, but legion, not so much a comedian as a company. If his name could be multiplied like his countenance, it might fill a playbill. He, and he alone, literally makes faces. Applied to any other person, the phrase is a mere figure, denoting certain modifications of the human countenance. Out of some invisible wardrobe he dips for faces, as his friend Seward used for wigs, and fetches them out as easily. We should not be surprised to see him some day put out the head of a river horse, or come forth a peewit or lapwing, some feathered metamorphosis. We have seen this gifted actor in Sir Christopher Curry, in Old Daunton, diffuse a glow of sentiment which has made the pulse of a crowded theatre beat like that of one man. When he has come in aid of the pulpit, doing good to the moral heart of a people. We have seen some faint approaches to this sort of excellence in other players, but in what has been truly denominated the sublime of farce, Munden stands out as single and unaccompanied as Hogarth. Hogarth, strange to tell, had no followers. The school of Munden began and must end with himself. Can any man wonder like him? Can any man see ghosts like him, or fight with his own shadow, a Cesar, as he does in that strangely neglected thing, the Cobbler of Preston, where his alternations from the Cobbler to the Magnifico, and from the Magnifico to the Cobbler, keep the brain of the spectator in as wild a ferment as if some Arabian night were being acted before him, or as if Thalaba were no tale. Who, like him, can throw, or ever attempted to throw, a supernatural interest over the commonest daily life objects? A table or a joint‐stool in his conception rises into a dignity equivalent to Cassiopeia's chair. It is invested with constellatory importance. You could not speak of it with more deference if it were mounted into the firmament. A beggar in the hands of Michael Angelo, says Fuseli, rose the patriarch of poverty. So the gusto of Munden antiquates and ennobles what it touches. His pots and his ladles are as grand and primal as the seething pots and hooks seen in old prophetic vision. A tub of butter, contemplated by him, amounts to a Platonic idea. He understands a leg of mutton in its quiddity. He stands wondering amid the commonplace materials of life, like primeval man, with the sun and stars about him. Elia. End of Essay 27. End of the last essays of Elia by Charles Lamb.